A black teen had just left the gas station when patrol lights suddenly cut him off. An officer yanked him from the seat and slammed him onto the hood, twisting his arms behind him. Then, to his disbelief, a plastic bag flashed under a harsh light. The radio barked, "Suspect in possession of narcotics." It all felt too smooth, like a setup, but they never realized a hidden witness was already recording every second. Before we dive in, where are you from? The warm summer air drifted through Jordan Carter's open windows as he gripped the steering wheel of his brand new Mercedes C-Class, the leather still carrying that distinct new car scent. At 18 years old, wearing his favorite State University t-shirt, he had every reason to feel proud. The college acceptance letter sat folded in his wallet, and this car was his reward for 4 years of straight A's and countless hours of community service. The gas gauge showed nearly empty, and Jordan spotted a familiar gas station ahead. As he pulled into the lot, his headlights illuminated a handwritten sign taped to the front window, "Security cameras out of order, sorry for the inconvenience." He smiled to himself, remembering how just 2 days ago he and his older sister Evelyn had celebrated his acceptance to State University over pepperoni pizza at their favorite downtown spot. She had looked at him with those proud big sister eyes and said, "Jordan, you're going to change the world someday." The gas pump clicked steadily as Jordan filled the tank, humming quietly to himself. Life felt full of possibilities. In just 6 weeks, he'd be on campus, studying business, maybe joining the debate team. But as he replaced the gas cap and climbed back into the driver's seat, Jordan couldn't shake a strange feeling that crept up his spine. The parking lot felt too quiet, too empty. He started the engine and pulled back onto Highway 83, unaware that 2 pairs of eyes had been watching him from the shadows. Lieutenant Karen Whitfield adjusted her rearview mirror and exchanged a look with Officer Riley Grant. They had been sitting in their patrol car for the past 20 minutes, waiting. When they spotted the black Mercedes pulling away from the gas station, Whitfield's eyes narrowed with calculated interest. "Look at that," she said, her voice carrying a deceptively calm tone that Grant had learned to recognize over their 2 years working together. "Nice car for someone his age." Grant cracked his knuckles, a nervous habit he'd developed since joining the force 18 months ago. At 23, he was still eager to prove himself to veteran officers like Whitfield, especially on these nights when everyone's tempers ran short. "You thinking what I'm thinking, Lieutenant?" Whitfield stared at the Mercedes for a long moment, her mind working. She had been on the force for 22 years, had survived 3 different police chiefs and countless difficult nights patrolling these same streets. Her ex-husband's gambling debts were crushing her financially, her teenage daughter barely spoke to her anymore, and her pension was still 5 years away. She needed arrests that stuck, commendations that mattered, and a clean record that would carry her to retirement. Especially now, with the new captain breathing down everyone's necks about quotas. "I'm thinking we should make sure everything's in order," she said finally, her smile cold and practiced as she flipped on the patrol car's lights. "This could be good for both of us, Riley. You need arrests on your record, and I need to show Captain Rodriguez that I'm still the most effective officer in this district." Grant felt a familiar mix of excitement and unease. While he respected Whitfield's experience, sometimes her methods made him deeply uncomfortable. Still, she had taught him more about real police work in 18 months than the academy had in 6 months of training. When Jordan saw the flashing lights cutting through the night air, his heart rate increased, but he remained calm. He had done nothing wrong. He pulled over safely, turned off the engine, and placed both hands on the steering wheel, just as his father had taught him during their driving lessons. Lieutenant Whitfield approached the driver's side window with what appeared to be a warm, almost motherly smile. She was in her late 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and the kind of professional demeanor that instantly put people at ease. "Good evening, son. License and registration, please." "Good evening, Lieutenant." Jordan's voice was polite and steady as he reached for his documents. "Is there a problem?" "Just routine, sweetheart." Whitfield's smile seemed genuinely kind, but her experienced eyes were scanning the interior of the car with methodical precision. "My goodness, what a beautiful vehicle you have here. How did you manage to afford something so nice?" Jordan handed over his license and registration. "It was a graduation gift from my parents. I just got accepted to State University." Officer Grant had positioned himself near the passenger side, and Jordan noticed the young officer seemed more agitated than usual, constantly shifting his weight. Grant's hand rested near his service weapon, and he seemed unusually nervous. "Congratulations on college, honey," Whitfield said, and her tone actually sounded sincere. "That's wonderful news. Must be planning to study something practical business, maybe. Mind if I ask what your parents do for a living? They must be very successful to afford such a generous gift." "My father owned a small construction company before he passed away 2 years ago, and my mother is a charge nurse at City General Hospital." Jordan kept his answers direct and honest, but something in Whitfield's tone made him add, "Lieutenant, I notice you're asking a lot of questions that don't seem related to why I was pulled over. Could you help me understand what specific traffic violation I'm suspected of?" Whitfield's pleasant expression remained, but Jordan caught a flash of something harder in her eyes. "Well, honey, you were driving a bit fast back there, and we just want to make sure everything's okay. You know how it is, young people sometimes get excited about new cars and college plans." Jordan felt perspiration beginning to form on his forehead. "Ma'am, I was monitoring my speedometer carefully and staying within the posted limit. If you clocked me at a different speed, I'd appreciate seeing the reading. And regarding your other concerns, I have all the proper documentation for the vehicle, which I've already provided." Whitfield's smile flickered for just a moment. This wasn't the nervous compliance she usually got from young black men during late-night stops. This kid was articulate, observant, and clearly educated. Her voice took on a slightly sharper edge, though she maintained the false sweetness. "You seem very prepared," she said, her tone cooling despite her maintained smile. "My father served as a military police officer before starting his construction company," Jordan replied steadily. "He taught me that respectful cooperation and knowing your rights aren't mutually exclusive." Grant shifted nervously, sensing the conversation changing direction, and Whitfield's body language was becoming more tense. The lieutenant's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and her fingers drummed once against her badge. A tell that Grant had learned meant trouble was coming. Officer Grant stepped closer to the passenger window, his youthful face tense with anticipation. "Lieutenant, maybe we should have him step out." "That's a good idea, Riley." Whitfield nodded approvingly, like a teacher praising a student, but her voice carried new steel beneath the false sweetness. "Step out of the vehicle, please, sweetheart." "Is that really necessary?" Jordan asked, though he was already unbuckling his seatbelt. As he did so, he discreetly activated the voice recording app on his phone, which remained in his pocket. Whitfield's smile began to take on a more predatory quality. "It's necessary when I say it's necessary. On. Now come on out so we can finish this up." As Jordan stepped onto the asphalt, he could feel the situation shifting dramatically. The cool night air hit his skin, and he noticed how isolated this stretch of highway was. No other cars, no witnesses. "Lieutenant, I want to be completely clear," Jordan said, trying to maintain his composure. "I haven't done anything wrong. I was just driving home from getting gas. I'm happy to cooperate, but I'd like to understand what's happening here." Whitfield studied him for a moment, her experienced eyes reading his body language, his tone, his level of fear. She had done this dance hundreds of times over the years. This kid was clean, which in some ways made him perfect for what she had in mind. Her smile grew colder, more calculated. "Officer Grant," she said, her voice shifting from false maternal warmth to business-like authority, "I'm detecting an odor of marijuana coming from this vehicle. We need to conduct a more thorough search." Grant hesitated, glancing between Whitfield and Jordan. "Lieutenant, do we have probable cause for a search?" Whitfield's eyes flashed with irritation, and her mask slipped further. "Officer Grant, are you questioning my professional judgment?" Her voice turned sharp, cutting through the night air. "I've been doing this job since before you were out of diapers. I detect marijuana coming from this vehicle, and the suspect is displaying nervous behavior. That's more than enough probable cause." Jordan's eyes widened. "I don't use drugs, Lieutenant. I don't even drink alcohol. You can test me right now if you want." "We'll see about that," Whitfield said, her false sweetness now completely replaced by cold authority. She grabbed Jordan's shoulder, her grip firm but not yet violent. "You just stand right there while Officer Grant does his job." The recording had been running for 3 minutes when Grant reluctantly began searching through Jordan's car. Whitfield positioned herself where she could guide Grant's discovery while maintaining plausible deniability. Her composure was holding, but Jordan could see the calculation in her eyes. "Check under the seats, Riley," she instructed, her voice now purely professional. "That's where they usually hide it." Grant's hands were shaking as he felt around under the passenger seat. He found nothing, of course, because there was nothing to find. He looked back at Whitfield, hoping she would call off the charade, but her face showed steely determination. Whitfield caught Grant's eye and nodded toward his pocket. They had discussed contingency plans before Preece, what to do when stops came up empty, but quotas needed to be met. Grant's hand trembled as he reached into his pocket, feeling the small plastic bag he'd been carrying for weeks. With trembling fingers, Grant pulled the small plastic bag from his pocket and quickly pressed it up under the passenger seat, then immediately began to search that area more thoroughly. "Lieutenant," he called out, his voice cracking with the weight of his actions, "I found something." But even as he said it, Grant felt physically ill. This wasn't what he had signed up for when he became a police officer. This wasn't justice, this was something corrupt and wrong. His hands shook as he held up the bag, careful not to look directly at Jordan. About 50 yards away, Officer David Mitchell sat in his white county sedan, finishing paperwork from an earlier domestic violence call. Through his windshield, he could see the traffic stop in progress, and something about the scene made him pause in his writing. Mitchell watched as Grant held up the plastic bag, and even from his distance, something felt off about the whole interaction. The body language seemed strange. Grant appeared nervous and ashamed rather than triumphant, and Whitfield looked too satisfied for what should have been a routine drug discovery. But Mitchell was exhausted from the long shift, and he told himself he was probably reading too much into a standard arrest. Still, something nagged at him, and he made a mental note of the time and location. Jordan's mind raced as he watched Grant handle the bag with his bare hands, a clear violation of evidence protocol. Every instinct told him this was wrong, but he forced himself to focus, remembering his father's lessons about staying calm under pressure. "Officers, I need you to hear me clearly," Jordan said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I have never seen that substance before in my life. I don't use drugs, I don't sell drugs, and I've never had drugs in my possession. I'm requesting that you follow proper evidence protocol, photographs, chain of custody documentation, and supervisor notification." Whitfield's maternal facade finally began to crack completely. Her smile turned into a sneer, and her voice carried undisguised contempt. "You think you're smart, don't you, college boy?" she said, her professionalism evaporating. "Think you know how police work operates? Think your fancy education makes you better than the people who keep this community safe?" "I know this isn't how it's supposed to work," Jordan replied, his fear and anger beginning to match her intensity. "You conducted a search based on questionable probable cause, your partner contaminated potential evidence by handling it without gloves, and neither of you documented the discovery process. Even if that substance was legitimately in my car, which it wasn't, this evidence would be inadmissible in court due to procedural violations." Grant stepped closer, his face flushed with anger and shame. "Who do you think is going to believe some punk kid over two sworn police officers? You think anyone's going to care about your rights?" Jordan looked directly at both officers, his voice calm but filled with righteous anger. "Anyone who cares about the truth will care," he said. "And I have a feeling there are more people watching than you realize." That's when Whitfield's control finally snapped. Her hand shot out and grabbed Jordan by his shirt collar, yanking him toward her until they were face to face. "Listen to me, you arrogant little piece of garbage," she hissed, her breath hot on his face. "You think you can come into my district in your fancy car, with your college acceptance, acting like you're better than everyone else? You're going to take these charges and keep your mouth shut, or I will destroy you and your entire family." Jordan tried to step back, but Whitfield's grip tightened, and she pushed him hard against his car. Grant immediately moved to Jordan's side, ready to interpret any defensive movement as resistance. "He's getting aggressive, he's trying to resist," Grant shouted, though his voice cracked with the knowledge of what they were really doing. The handcuffs were burning hot from sitting in the patrol car, searing Jordan's wrists as they clicked into place, too tight, deliberately tight. Jordan winced but said nothing, knowing that any complaint would only make things worse. "This isn't right," Jordan managed to say, his voice steady despite the pain. I want to call my sister. I want to call a lawyer. Whitfield's face was twisted with rage and satisfaction. You'll get your phone call when we decide you get your phone call, she spat, shoving him toward the patrol car with unnecessary force. Maybe spending some time in a cell will adjust your attitude. As they drove away, leaving Jordan's Mercedes on the shoulder, with its hazard lights blinking, Jordan closed his eyes and tried to find strength in his father's memory. Somewhere in his mind, he heard his father's voice, "Son, there's good and bad in every profession. The measure of a person isn't their job title, it's how they treat people who can't fight back." The recording on his phone had captured everything: Grant's reluctant participation, the suspicious timing of the discovery, Whitfield's escalating aggression and unprofessional language, the obvious procedural violations. But would it be enough to overcome two police officers' testimony in court? The holding cell offered no relief from the oppressive heat, and Jordan sat on the narrow bench in his sweat-soaked t-shirt, his wrists still bearing red marks from the deliberately tight handcuffs. His left cheek was swollen from where he had been accidentally pushed into a wall during the booking process. It had been 8 hours since his arrest. No one had told him what specific charges he was facing. No one had offered him medical attention for his injuries. No one had allowed him to make the phone call he was entitled to under law. The booking process had been a calculated humiliation. Whitfield had accidentally shoved Jordan into a concrete wall while taking his fingerprints, claiming his hands had been slippery from sweat. Grant had yanked his arms roughly while removing the handcuffs, leaving deep impressions on his wrists. Every interaction was designed to intimidate and demoralize. "Oops," Whitfield had sneered when Jordan's shoulder hit the wall. "These floors can be so slippery when people don't watch where they're going." During processing, other officers had joined in the mockery. "Look at Mr. College Boy," one had sneered. "Not so smart now, are you?" Another had made comments about Jordan's appearance and background that were so vile and racist, they made his stomach turn. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor. Whitfield and Grant appeared outside his cell just after sunrise, looking refreshed and confident. "Sleep well, sweetheart?" Whitfield asked mockingly. "You look a little worse for wear." Grant chuckled nervously, but Jordan could see the discomfort in the young officer's eyes. "Maybe he fell down some stairs. These old buildings can be dangerous if you're not careful." Jordan stood up slowly, every muscle in his body aching from the narrow bench and the stress of the night. His t-shirt was damp with perspiration, and he wiped sweat from his forehead. "I want to speak to a lawyer, I want to make my phone call, and I want to know what I'm being charged with." Whitfield's smile turned vicious, her patience clearly worn thin by a sleepless night of preparing their story. "You're being charged with possession of cocaine with intent to distribute, resisting arrest, and assault on a police officer," she said, her voice dripping with malicious satisfaction. "That's looking at 15 to 20 years in state prison. Hope those college dreams were worth it." "I didn't possess any drugs. You planted that bag in my car," Jordan said, his voice steady despite his exhaustion and fear. Both officers laughed, but there was an edge to their humor, the forced confidence of people trying to convince themselves as much as their audience. "Prove it, college boy," Grant said, his earlier nervousness replaced by defensive aggression. "It's your word against ours, and we have the physical evidence." "I have evidence too," Jordan said quietly, watching as both officers' expressions shifted slightly. The laughter stopped immediately. "What kind of evidence?" Whitfield demanded, her voice sharp with sudden concern. "My phone was recording the entire interaction from the moment you asked me to step out of the car. Everything you did, everything you said, every procedural violation. It's all documented." For a moment, uncertainty flickered across both officers' faces as they processed this information. They exchanged a quick glance that Jordan didn't miss, a look that confirmed his suspicions about their coordination. Then Whitfield's face twisted into a sneer, though Jordan noticed her hands had begun to shake slightly. "Audio recordings can be faked, manipulated, taken out of context," she said, her voice rising. "Happens all the time. Besides, who's going to believe some drug dealer over two decorated police officers with years of service to this community?" Grant leaned against the cell bars, trying to project confidence. "You should have thought about consequences before you decided to get uppity with us. Maybe if you had shown proper respect instead of acting like some kind of legal expert, things would have gone differently." "Proper respect?" Jordan's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm. "I was nothing but respectful. I called you officer and lieutenant, I followed every instruction, I provided all requested documentation without complaint. You were a smart ass from the moment we pulled you over," Whitfield snapped, her composure completely gone. "Acting like you were better than us, questioning our authority, citing procedures like you were some kind of expert. Well, guess what, college boy? Your education won't help you where you're going." Jordan stared at both officers, seeing their motivations laid bare. "So this is really about race, isn't it? About putting me in what you consider my place? This is about respect for law enforcement," Grant snarled, though his voice cracked slightly. "Something your generation doesn't understand. You think you can question everything, challenge everything, act like the rules don't apply to you." As the officers walked away, their footsteps echoing in the corridor, Jordan closed his eyes and remembered something his father had told him. "Son, the measure of a person isn't their job title, it's how they treat people who can't fight back." The memory gave him strength, reminding him that his father's military police background had prepared him for exactly this situation. He began mentally cataloging every detail: the time of the stop, license plate numbers, badge numbers, every unprofessional comment, every procedural violation, every moment of the illegal search. If he was going to fight this, he needed to be precise and perfect. The system was designed to believe them over him, but he wasn't broken. Not yet. Miles away, Evelyn Carter jolted awake to her phone buzzing insistently on her nightstand. It was 6 in the morning, and Marcus Washington, Jordan's best friend from high school, was calling in a panic. "Evelyn, I think something happened to Jordan," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "He was supposed to pick me up for our workout at 5:30 this morning. He never showed up, and that's not like him. He's never late for anything, especially not without calling." Evelyn sat up immediately, already reaching for her clothes. "Did you try calling him? His phone goes straight to voicemail. I drove to your house, his car's not there. I checked the gym, the library, even drove by the gas station he usually goes to. Nobody's seen him." Evelyn's blood ran cold. As a defense attorney with 10 years of experience, she had seen too many cases where young black men simply disappeared into the system without their families knowing. "Marcus, I need you to think carefully. Did Jordan mention going anywhere last night? Anyone he was meeting?" "No, he just said he was going to get gas and head home early because he wanted to be fresh for our workout." That was around 11 p.m. By 6:30 in the morning, Evelyn was making calls. Her connections in the legal community had taught her that the first few hours were crucial in cases like this. She started with the hospitals, then moved to the police stations, working her way through the bureaucracy with practiced efficiency. It took 45 minutes and 6 different phone calls to find Jordan in the system. When she finally learned he was being held on drug charges at the downtown precinct, her world tilted on its axis. "That's impossible," she told the desk sergeant. "My brother doesn't use drugs, he doesn't even drink alcohol." "Ma'am, he was found with a substantial amount of cocaine in his possession. That's a serious felony charge, he's being held pending arraignment." Evelyn's legal training kicked in immediately. She knew enough about police procedure and drug cases to understand that something was very wrong with this scenario. Jordan was careful, intelligent, and had been raised to be respectful during any police encounter. For him to be arrested on drug charges with no prior history suggested either a terrible mistake or something much worse. Her next call was to her mother at City General Hospital, where Diana was just finishing a 12-hour shift in the emergency department. "Mama, Jordan's been arrested." Diana Carter had been a nurse for 22 years, had treated countless victims of violence and injustice, and had learned to keep her professional composure even in the most horrific situations. But hearing those words about her baby boy nearly brought her to her knees. "What are the charges?" Diana asked, her medical training allowing her to focus on facts even as her heart raced with fear and disbelief. "Possession with intent to distribute, resisting arrest and assault on a police officer. That's impossible. Jordan wouldn't hurt a fly, and you know he's never touched drugs in his life." "I know, Mama, which means something very bad happened during that traffic stop." Evelyn's connections in the legal community proved invaluable. Within 30 minutes, she had contacted Lieutenant Patricia Morrison from Internal Affairs and District Attorney Maria Sanchez. Both were people she had worked with before: Morrison through cases involving police misconduct, and Sanchez through her work as a defense attorney. Patricia, This is Evelyn Carter. I need your help with a potential misconduct case involving my brother. Morrison's voice was cautious but professional. Evelyn, you know I can't discuss active investigations. Then let's make sure this becomes an active investigation. My 18-year-old brother, honor student, no criminal record, college-bound, was arrested last night on serious drug charges. Given his background and character, I have serious concerns about the circumstances of his arrest. What specifically are you alleging? I'm not alleging anything yet, but I'm formally requesting that internal affairs be present when I interview my client, who happens to be my brother. Something about this situation doesn't add up, and I want to make sure we get to the truth. Evelyn Carter burst through the police station doors at 7 in the morning, her heels clicking against the tile floor with determined urgency. Behind her walked Internal Affairs Lieutenant Patricia Morrison and District Attorney Maria Sanchez. Diana Carter followed closely, still wearing her hospital scrubs from the night shift that had ended just 3 hours earlier. Diana's trained medical eye had immediately assessed the situation when Evelyn called her. 22 years as an emergency room nurse had taught her to recognize the signs of police brutality, and she had seen too many families destroyed by corrupt officers who thought their badges made them untouchable. I want to see my son immediately, Diana demanded at the front desk, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades dealing with life and death situations. The desk sergeant looked up nervously. Ma'am, visiting hours don't start until. I'm not a visitor. I'm his mother and a medical professional. Diana's voice cut through the morning quiet like a scalpel. This young man has been denied medical attention and legal representation for over 8 hours despite obvious injuries. You'll produce him now, or I'll have the hospital administrator call the mayor about civil rights violations and medical neglect. Evelyn stepped forward. I'm also his attorney and legal guardian. These are officials from Internal Affairs and the district attorney's office. My mother is right. You've violated multiple protocols by denying medical care and legal access to someone in custody. 30 minutes later, Jordan was brought to an interview room. Diana Carter's professional composure held when she first saw her son, but barely. His face was swollen on one side, his wrists bore clear marks from overly tight handcuffs, and his posture suggested someone who had been systematically intimidated and abused. Jordan, baby, I need you to tell me where it hurts, she said, her voice steady as she began examining his injuries with practiced efficiency. Mama, Jordan said quietly, his voice hoarse from hours in a dry cell without water. They planted drugs in my car. They said no one would believe me over them. Diana's hand stilled for a moment as she processed what her son had said, then continued her examination. Years of working emergency rooms had taught her that the stories police reports told weren't always the ones written on victims' bodies. Your daddy always said that truth has a way of coming out, she whispered. Then louder, Lieutenant Morrison, I'm documenting injuries consistent with multiple points of impact and deliberate restraint trauma. These aren't defensive wounds or results of accidental contact during a lawful arrest. This appears to be systematic abuse. Lieutenant Morrison leaned forward, her notebook ready. Jordan, I need you to tell us exactly what happened from the very beginning. Take your time and be as detailed as possible. Jordan's account was methodical and precise. He described the pretextual nature of the traffic stop, the escalating questions that had nothing to do with any traffic violation, Grant's obvious nervousness during the search, Whitfield's increasingly aggressive behavior, the planting of evidence, and the physical abuse that followed. Throughout his narrative, his voice remained calm and factual, though Diana could see the trauma in his eyes. They said it would be my word against theirs and that no one would believe a drug dealer over 2 decorated police officers, Jordan concluded. But I recorded everything. He produced his phone and played the audio. The room fell silent as they listened to the conversation, starting with Whitfield's false maternal concern, escalating through Jordan's respectful but pointed questions about procedure, Grant's nervous fumbling during the search, Whitfield's explosion of racist anger, and the sounds of physical violence that followed. When the recording ended, Lieutenant Morrison's face was grave, but her response was measured and realistic. This audio recording provides significant evidence of procedural violations, unprofessional conduct, and inappropriate use of force, she said carefully. It clearly documents that the officers used improper language, failed to follow standard evidence protocols, and escalated the situation beyond what the circumstances warranted. District Attorney Sanchez leaned forward, her expression serious. "Jordan, I want you to understand something important about how this evidence will be viewed. This audio proves the officers behaved unprofessionally and violated proper procedures. It shows they used racist language and excessive force, but legally speaking, it doesn't definitively prove that you didn't have drugs in your car." Jordan felt his heart sink. "But you can hear them discussing the search, hear how nervous Grant was, hear Whitfield's coaching." "What we hear," Morrison said slowly, "are conversations and interactions that strongly suggest misconduct, but that could potentially be interpreted in different ways by a defense attorney. They might argue that Grant was nervous because he was a young officer following proper search procedures. They might claim that Whitfield's comments, while inappropriate, don't prove evidence tampering." Diana's voice was sharp with frustration. "So you're saying this recording doesn't clear my son?" "I'm saying this recording proves misconduct and gives us solid grounds for internal discipline," Morrison replied. "It also provides strong evidence for civil rights violations. But for criminal charges against the officers, and to fully exonerate Jordan, we would ideally want something more concrete, something that visually documents the evidence planting, not just suggests it." Evelyn leaned forward. "What would constitute that level of evidence?" "Independent visual corroboration, video footage from a neutral source, multiple witnesses, physical evidence that completely contradicts the officer's written account." As they prepared to leave, Diana asked the crucial question, "What about bail?" Morrison consulted her notes. "Given the severity of the charges, particularly the alleged assault on an officer, bail has been set at $50,000. Diana's heart sank. Even with Jordan's father's life insurance money and her own savings, coming up with that kind of cash would be nearly impossible for their family on short notice. But Evelyn had already thought of this. "I'll put up my condo as collateral. We're getting Jordan out today." As they walked out into the oppressive morning heat, Jordan between his mother and sister, he felt more trapped than protected. The recording that had given him hope now seemed like a small weapon against an enormous machine designed to protect itself. "This is just the beginning," Diana said, though her voice carried doubt. "We knew this wouldn't be easy." Jordan could see the uncertainty in his family's eyes. If his recording wasn't enough, if his mother's medical expertise wasn't enough, if his sister's legal knowledge wasn't enough, then what would be? Later that afternoon, Evelyn and Diana stood together at a podium outside the courthouse, facing a crowd of reporters and cameras. Diana had used her influence at the hospital to take emergency family leave, something she had never done in 22 years of nursing, to support her son and speak out against injustice. "My son is an honor student who was brutally assaulted by police officers and had drugs planted in his car for the crime of driving while black," Evelyn said, her voice ringing clear and strong despite the oppressive heat. Diana stepped forward, her nurse's uniform lending authority to her words. "As a medical professional with 22 years of experience treating trauma victims, I can tell you that the injuries inflicted on my son were consistent with systematic abuse, not incidental contact during a lawful arrest." She held up a folder of medical documentation. "I have photographic evidence and professional medical testimony that will show exactly what these officers did to my child. Jordan's father served as a military police officer, and he taught our family that law enforcement should protect and serve, not brutalize and frame innocent people." The hashtag Justice for Jordan began trending within hours. Thousands of people shared the story, expressing outrage at the obvious injustice. Support poured in from across the country. Donations for legal fees, offers of pro bono assistance, messages of encouragement. But the backlash came just as quickly and was far more vicious than anyone had anticipated. Anonymous social media accounts began spreading rumors that Jordan had a history of violence and drug use. They claimed he had been suspended from school for fighting, that he had been arrested before, that the expensive car was purchased with drug money. They posted fake documents, altered photos, and fabricated testimonies from supposed classmates. The most damaging attack came from a website that published what appeared to be Jordan's juvenile records, showing multiple arrests for drug possession and assault. The documents looked official, complete with case numbers and court seals. They were completely fabricated, but they spread across social media faster than the truth could catch up. Diana was devastated when she saw the fake records. "They're trying to destroy everything your father and I worked to build for you," she said, tears streaming down her face as she held Jordan. "These people are evil, baby. They're trying to make people think we raised you wrong. One evening, as Jordan sat in his room feeling overwhelmed by the attacks on his character and family, Diana knocked on his door. She entered carrying a small wooden box he recognized. "Your daddy's things," she said softly. "I thought you might need to remember who you are." Inside the box was his father's military police badge and a single folded letter. Jordan opened it with trembling hands. "Son, if you're reading this, it means someone is testing your strength and character. Remember, a man's worth isn't determined by what others say about him but by what he knows to be true about himself. Stand tall, tell the truth, and trust that we raised you right. The truth has a way of rising to the surface, no matter how deep people try to bury it." Dad, for the first time since this nightmare began, Jordan felt genuinely hopeful. But he also knew the real battle was just beginning. Whitfield and Grant were experienced at playing this game, and they had the entire system backing them up. Meanwhile, Whitfield and Grant were adapting to the new reality of being under investigation. Both officers had been placed on administrative leave pending the internal affairs investigation, but they weren't sitting idle. "The recording is a problem," Grant said as he met with Whitfield in a coffee shop across town. He looked haggard, having barely slept since the arrest became public. "The recording shows we did our job," Whitfield replied coldly. "A drug dealer resisted arrest and got hurt in the process. It happens. Karen, we planted those drugs, you know it, I know it, and now there's audio evidence. What I know," Whitfield said, leaning forward with menacing intensity, "is that you'd better stick to our story. Because if you break, we both go down. And if we go down, I'll make sure everyone knows whose idea it was to plant that evidence." Grant's face went pale. "It wasn't my idea, you ordered me to do it. Prove it, your word against mine, and I have 22 years of stellar service record. You have 18 months and a recording that could be interpreted a dozen different ways." The psychological pressure was working. Grant was young, scared, and completely under Whitfield's control. But 50 miles away, Leo Harris was having his own crisis of conscience. The county highway maintenance supervisor had been wrestling with what he had seen that night for weeks. His dashboard camera had captured the entire traffic stop, and the footage clearly showed the officers planting evidence. Leo had been in a similar situation 20 years earlier when he had witnessed his supervisor stealing from the company. He had reported the theft and found himself accused of the same crime. It had taken 2 years and most of his savings to clear his name. But this case was different. This wasn't about money or company property. This was about a young man's life being destroyed by corrupt cops. The knock on his door came on a Thursday evening. Evelyn Carter stood in the hallway, her expression serious but hopeful. "Mr. Harris, my name is Evelyn Carter. I believe you have information about my brother's case." Leo had been expecting this visit. Word had gotten out that his truck had been in the area that night, and several people had mentioned seeing a county vehicle parked near the gas station. "Miss Carter, I want to help, but you have to understand. I've been down this road before. When you go against cops, they find ways to make your life hell. I understand your concern," Evelyn said gently. "But my brother is facing 20 years in prison for crimes he didn't commit." Leo showed her the dashboard camera footage. As they watched together, Evelyn's jaw tightened with anger, but also with relief. This was visual proof of what had happened. "Mr. Harris, this footage doesn't just show inappropriate behavior. It proves evidence tampering. You can see Officer Grant approaching the car with something already in his hand, before he claims to search. Then watch his movements. He doesn't search systematically like proper procedure. He goes straight to one spot, plants something, then immediately finds it. That's what caught my attention," Leo said grimly. "Real searches are methodical. This looked choreographed. This is what we needed," Evelyn said, excitement building in her voice. "The audio recording proves misconduct and procedural violations, but this video proves the actual crime. It shows them bringing evidence to plant, not discovering evidence that was there." But Leo had more information. "There's something else. See that car in the background? The white sedan that's parked near the gas station during the whole stop?" Evelyn leaned closer to the screen. "Yes, I see it. That's a county vehicle. I ran the plates through our system. It belongs to another officer who was supposed to be off duty that night." Evelyn's eyes widened. "You're saying there was a third officer there?" "I'm saying someone else witnessed everything that happened to your brother, and they didn't report it or intervene. That makes them either complicit or afraid, and either way, they might be willing to talk if the right pressure is applied. The next day, Jordan visited Leo personally. The young man's face still bore the marks of his beating, but his eyes were clear and determined. "Mr. Harris," Jordan said, "I know you're scared, I'm scared too, but I'm not just fighting for myself anymore. I'm fighting for every kid who looks like me who might find themselves in this situation in the future." Leo looked at this 18-year-old boy who was showing more courage and integrity than most adults he knew. "Son," he said finally, "I'll testify. And I'll make sure that video gets to the right people." As Jordan left Leo's apartment, the older man watched from his window and remembered his own father's words. "Sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything, but not doing it costs you your soul." Meanwhile, Officer David Mitchell was consumed by guilt and fear. He had seen everything that night from his county vehicle, but had convinced himself he was mistaken about what he was witnessing. Over the weeks since Jordan's arrest, Mitchell had tried to rationalize what he had seen. Maybe Grant had legitimate reasons for his search pattern. Maybe the bag had been there all along. Maybe his angle had been wrong. But the doubts kept growing, especially after 3 separate encounters with Whitfield that felt more like warnings than casual conversation. The first had been 2 days after the arrest. "Shame about that Carter kid," she had said while they were both at the coffee machine. "Drug dealers are getting younger and more sophisticated these days. Good thing Grant found that evidence before the kid could dispose of it." The second was a week later, when she'd stopped by his desk to chat about his performance review. "You've been doing good work, Mitchell. Keep your head down, follow procedures, don't get caught up in other people's drama. That's how you build a solid career." The third was just yesterday, when she'd approached him in the parking lot. "I heard IA might be asking officers about that Carter arrest. Hope you don't have anything to complicate a straightforward drug bust. Some people like to stir up trouble where there isn't any." Each conversation had been casual, friendly even. But Mitchell understood the subtext. Stay quiet. Don't ask questions. Don't be a problem. The guilt was eating him alive, but Mitchell also understood the reality of police culture. Officers who reported misconduct by their colleagues often found themselves ostracized, transferred to dangerous beats, or forced out of the department entirely. He had a mortgage, a wife, and a baby daughter to support. When Lieutenant Morrison had asked all officers to report any knowledge of the incident, Mitchell had lied and said he saw nothing unusual. When pressed about his presence in the area, he'd said he'd been focused on paperwork and hadn't paid attention to the traffic stop. But now, with the trial approaching and news reports detailing Jordan's injuries and the evidence against him, Mitchell was consumed by the weight of his silence. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and couldn't look at his baby daughter without thinking about what kind of world he was helping to create for her. His phone buzzed with a text message from Whitfield. "Remember what we discussed about being a team player. Some things are better left unsaid. Hope to see you at the retirement party next month." The message was clearly a reminder of their unspoken agreement, but it also made Mitchell realize that Whitfield was confident enough in her control over the situation to plan for her future. She believed she would get away with framing Jordan, and Mitchell's silence was a crucial part of that plan. Mitchell stared at the message for a long time, then looked at a photo on his desk of his wife holding their baby daughter. What kind of man did he want to be when she was old enough to understand right from wrong? He deleted Whitfield's message and opened his laptop. It was time to document everything he had witnessed that night, before he lost his courage again. The courthouse steps were packed with protesters, reporters, and curious onlookers as Jordan arrived with Evelyn and their legal team. Chants of justice for Jordan, mixed with counter-protesters shouting "Support our police" and much worse. Signs reading "Drug dealers belong in prison" and "Stop the anti-police lies" were held by people who had never met Jordan but had already decided he was guilty. Inside the courtroom, District Attorney Sanchez stood before the jury and played Jordan's phone recording. The audio quality was clear, and the jury listened intently as Grant's nervousness about the search echoed through the speakers, followed by Whitfield's escalating aggression and racist threats, and the sounds of violence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sanchez said after the recording ended, "you have just heard evidence of a shocking abuse of power and a criminal conspiracy. Jordan Carter was assaulted, falsely arrested, and had evidence planted on him by officers who took an oath to serve and protect." The defense attorney, Robert Hayes, stood for cross-examination with confidence. He had been defending police officers for 20 years and knew every trick in the book. Mr. Carter, Hayes began, his tone friendly but probing, audio recordings can be edited, can't they? Manipulated to make innocent interactions sound sinister. Jordan's voice was steady. Yes sir, they can. But this recording wasn't edited, it captures exactly what happened. But you would say that, wouldn't you? Hayes pressed. You have every incentive to make my clients look bad. I have every incentive to tell the truth. Hayes spent the next hour trying to rattle Jordan, bringing up the fabricated juvenile records, suggesting he was a drug dealer trying to frame innocent officers, implying that he had provoked the confrontation. With each accusation, Jordan remained calm and factual. Mr. Carter, isn't it convenient that you just happened to be recording during this encounter? Hayes asked. I started recording because I was scared, Jordan replied. I've seen the news, I've heard the stories. I know what can happen to people who look like me during police encounters. So you went into this interaction with a hostile attitude toward law enforcement. Jordan was quiet for a moment, then he leaned forward toward the microphone. Sir, I went into this interaction, hoping I would never need the recording. I was raised to respect law enforcement. I was taught that police officers were people you could turn to when you needed help. What happened to me didn't change my respect for good police officers. It just showed me the difference between good officers and bad ones. When Lieutenant Whitfield took the stand, she maintained her composure, insisting that Jordan had been aggressive and combative from the beginning. She claimed that the drugs were found during a legitimate search and that Jordan's injuries were the result of his own resistance. Officer Whitfield, Sanchez said during cross-examination, you've described Mr. Carter as aggressive and dangerous. Does this aggressive, dangerous person sound like someone who would politely ask permission to reach for his phone to call his family? Whitfield's jaw tightened. People can be deceptive, they can put on an act. Or maybe, Sanchez continued, the only deception in this courtroom is coming from you. When Grant testified, he claimed that Jordan had been reaching for something under his seat when the drugs were discovered. But under cross-examination, Sanchez exposed the holes in his story. Officer Grant, you testified that you found the drugs under the passenger seat. But the recording clearly shows you searching the driver's side first, then moving to the passenger side. Why would you search the driver's side if you suspected Mr. Carter had hidden something on the passenger side? Grant shifted uncomfortably. Standard procedure is to search the entire vehicle. But you didn't search the entire vehicle initially, did you? You went straight to the passenger seat after searching the driver's side came up empty. Almost as if you knew exactly where to look. I was being thorough. Were you being thorough when you handled potential evidence without gloves? Without taking photographs, without calling for backup witnesses? Grant's confidence was cracking. We follow proper protocol. Do you? Because according to department guidelines, any drug seizure requires immediate photographing, proper evidence bags, chain of custody documentation, and supervisor notification. You did none of these things, did you? The situation was fluid. The situation was fabricated, Sanchez interrupted, and you know it. The next day brought the witnesses who would determine Jordan's fate. Leo Harris walked to the witness stand with slow, deliberate steps. His dashboard camera video was loaded and ready to play on the courtroom's display system. As the video began, the room fell completely silent. The footage was clear and damning in a way that audio could never be. The jury could see Jordan's polite compliance during the initial stop. More importantly, they could see Grant approaching the passenger side of the vehicle with his hand positioned as if he was already holding something. The video showed Grant's search in real time, not the methodical, systematic approach taught in police academies, but a direct movement to a specific location under the passenger seat. They could watch him plant the bag and immediately discover it, his movements awkward and obviously rehearsed. When the video ended, several jurors were shaking their heads in disgust. One woman in the back row was wiping tears from her eyes. Mr. Harris, Sanchez said gently, this footage clearly shows Officer Grant had something in his possession before he began his search. Can you describe what that means from a procedural standpoint? Leo's voice was steady. In proper evidence collection, officers search systematically and photograph or document anything they find before moving it. What this video shows is the opposite. Missed it. An officer going directly to a specific location to place something, then immediately finding it. That's not police work, that's evidence planting. During cross-examination, Hayes tried desperately to discredit Leo, suggesting that he had altered the video or that he had some personal grudge against police. "Mr. Harris, isn't it true that you were once fired from a security job for theft?" "I was falsely accused of theft by my supervisor, who was stealing from the company himself. I was cleared of all charges when the truth came out." "So you have a history of conflict with authority figures." "I have a history of standing up to corruption, yes sir." Hayes pressed harder. "How do we know you didn't doctor this video to support Mr. Carter's false claims?" Leo pulled out a manila folder. "Because I have the metadata from the camera system, the GPS logs showing my truck's location, and the timestamp data that proves this video is authentic. I also have the maintenance records showing that our dashboard cameras automatically upload to county servers, so there are backup copies that can verify the original." Hayes' face went pale. He hadn't expected Leo to be so thoroughly prepared. Then came the moment no one expected. The defense calls Officer David Mitchell to the stand. Mitchell had been listed as a character witness for Whitfield and Grant, expected to testify about their professionalism and dedication. But as he walked to the witness stand, something in his posture suggested a different plan. Hayes began with routine questions about Mitchell's experience working with the defendants. Mitchell's answers were short and professional. Then Hayes made his crucial mistake. "Officer Mitchell, in your experience are Lieutenant Whitfield and Officer Grant the type of officers who would fabricate evidence or assault a suspect?" Mitchell was quiet for a long moment. His wife was in the courtroom holding their baby daughter. His fellow officers sat in the gallery, expecting him to protect the thin blue line. But as he looked at Jordan Carter sitting at the defendant's table, he thought about his own daughter and the world he was helping to create for her. "Mr. Hayes," Mitchell said slowly, "I need to tell the truth about what I witnessed on the night in question." The courtroom erupted. Judge Martinez pounded his gavel demanding order. Hayes looked like he had been struck by lightning. Mitchell continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I was parked near the gas station that night, finishing paperwork from an earlier call. I witnessed the entire traffic stop from approximately 50 yards away." He took a deep breath. "I saw Officer Grant plant the drugs in Mr. Carter's vehicle. I heard Lieutenant Whitfield make racist threats and comments. I watched them assault Mr. Carter during the arrest, and I did nothing to stop it." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Even the protesters outside seemed to sense that something monumental had just occurred. Mitchell produced a notebook and several evidence bags. "I documented everything I saw that night. I also collected the original evidence bag that Officer Grant discarded after planting the drugs in Mr. Carter's car." Sanchez stood up, her voice barely controlled. "Your Honor, I request an immediate recess to examine this evidence." But Mitchell wasn't finished. "There's something else the court needs to know. After Mr. Carter's arrest, Lieutenant Whitfield approached me privately. She told me that if I ever spoke about what I had witnessed, I would find myself facing the same charges as Mr. Carter." He looked directly at Whitfield, who had gone completely white. She said, and I quote, "Sometimes good officers have to do bad things to bad people. That boy needed to learn his place, and now he has." Grant was staring at Mitchell with undisguised hatred, but Whitfield looked like she was about to be sick. Judge Martinez called for an immediate recess. As the jury filed out, Jordan sat in stunned silence. Evelyn grabbed his hand, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she whispered. "They can't recover from this." But Jordan wasn't celebrating yet. He had learned not to trust hope until victory was certain. Too many things had gone wrong for him to believe it was really over until the jury spoke. The jury deliberated for nearly 2 full days, much longer than anyone had expected. When they filed back into the courtroom, their faces were serious but not clearly resolved. Jordan sat between Evelyn and his attorney, trying to prepare himself for either outcome. What Jordan's family didn't know was that the deliberations had been complicated by an unexpected revelation. Juror #7, a retired postal worker named Frank Morrison, had waited until the final day to disclose that his nephew was a police officer in a neighboring district. "I didn't think it mattered at first," Morrison had told the bailiff, "but listening to all this testimony about police culture and loyalty, I realized I might be biased. My nephews told me stories about how officers have to stick together, even when they disagree with each other's actions." The revelation had thrown the jury into chaos. Some wanted Morrison removed. Others felt his honesty showed integrity. Judge Martinez had ultimately decided to let the jury continue, but the damage to their unity was done. The foreman stood, a middle-aged black woman who had listened intently throughout the trial. Your Honor, we have reached a verdict on some charges, but we are deadlocked on others. Judge Martinez frowned. Please read the verdicts you have reached. On the charge of possession of cocaine with intent to distribute, we find the defendant not guilty. Jordan's shoulders sagged with relief. On the charge of resisting arrest, we find the defendant not guilty. However, Your Honor, we are deadlocked 11-1 on the charge of assault on a police officer. Despite extensive deliberation, we cannot reach a unanimous decision. The single holdout, as it turned out, had been Frank Morrison. Despite his nephew's influence, or perhaps because of it, he had been the lone voice insisting that Jordan must have done something to provoke the officer's response. Jordan felt the weight of continued uncertainty, but something had fundamentally changed. The system that had seemed designed to destroy him had at least partially acknowledged his innocence. But the drama wasn't over. Within minutes of the partial verdict, Judge Martinez made an unexpected announcement. While the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict on all charges against Mr. Carter, the evidence presented in this trial has revealed serious questions about the conduct of the arresting officers. I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential criminal charges against Lieutenant Whitfield and Officer Grant. It wasn't the complete vindication Jordan had hoped for, but it was something. Whitfield and Grant would face their own legal battles, even if his wasn't completely over. Officer Mitchell stood at the back of the courtroom, watching his former colleagues face the possibility of criminal charges. Several officers turned their backs on him as he passed, making it clear that he would never be welcome in law enforcement again. But when Jordan approached him, the young officer straightened. "Thank you," Jordan said simply. "You saved my life." Mitchell nodded, his eyes reflecting both pride and sadness. "I should have spoken up sooner. I should have stopped them that night." "You did what you could when it mattered most," Jordan replied. "That takes courage." 8 months later, Lieutenant Whitfield and Officer Grant faced their own criminal trial. The prosecution, led by a federal attorney brought in to avoid conflicts of interest, had spent months building their case. But it wasn't as straightforward as Jordan's supporters had hoped. Whitfield's defense team painted a picture of a dedicated officer who had made difficult decisions in dangerous situations. Lieutenant Whitfield served this community for 22 years with distinction, the defense attorney argued. Are we really going to destroy the career and reputation of a decorated officer based on a few moments of poor judgment during a high-stress situation? The defense strategy was sophisticated, acknowledged that mistakes might have been made, but framed them as good faith errors rather than criminal misconduct. They brought in character witnesses, showed Whitfield's commendations, and highlighted her years of service. Grant's attorney took a different approach, portraying him as a young officer who was following the lead of his experienced supervisor. Riley Grant was 23 years old, 18 months out of the academy, working with a veteran lieutenant. When your supervisor tells you to do something, you do it. When Whitfield took the stand in her own defense, she was composed and articulate. She expressed regret for any appearance of impropriety but maintained that she had been doing her job as she understood it. "I never intended to harm Mr. Carter," she testified. "If my actions caused him distress, I regret that. But I was operating based on my training and my experience." The jury deliberated for 5 days before reaching their verdict: guilty on some charges, not guilty on others, and hung on the most serious federal civil rights violations. Whitfield was convicted of assault and evidence tampering, but acquitted of the conspiracy charges. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison, and forfeiture of her pension, a significant punishment, but far less than what Jordan's family had hoped for. Grant was convicted of evidence tampering, but acquitted of assault charges. The jury apparently accepted his attorney's argument that he was following orders from a superior officer. He received 6 months in jail and 2 years of probation. Both officers lost their jobs, but neither would serve more than 2 years in prison for their actions. 2 years after his trial, Jordan stood before a criminal justice class at the state university. His case had become a study in how the system worked, in where it failed. "The question I get most often," Jordan told the students, "is whether I hate the officers who arrested me. The answer changes depending on the day you ask me." A student raised her hand. "Do you think they deserved their sentences?" Jordan paused, thinking of Whitfield's 18 months in prison and Grant's 6 months. "I think the system protected them even after they were convicted. But I also learned that expecting perfect justice from an imperfect system is a recipe for disappointment." His phone buzzed with a message from Marcus Washington, the teenager who had approached him years earlier, starting my freshman year at law school next week. Thanks for showing me what's possible. Jordan smiled and typed back, the fight continues, make us proud. As they walked across campus, Jordan reflected on how the experience had shaped him. He was no longer the 18-year-old who had believed the system would automatically protect him, but he also wasn't consumed by bitterness. He was something more complex, a young man who understood that justice was not a destination but a direction, who had learned that hope required action to survive, and who knew that real change happened not in dramatic courtroom victories, but in the quiet work of people who refused to accept injustice as inevitable. At home that evening, Jordan sat at the kitchen table with Diana and Evelyn, sharing a simple dinner. His father's badge sat on the windowsill, catching the last rays of sunlight. How does it feel? Evelyn asked. Jordan thought for a moment, like I survived something I shouldn't have had to survive, but also like I understand something about the world that I didn't before. Diana reached across the table. Your daddy would be proud of who you've become, baby. I hope so, Mama. I really hope so. Outside, the city hummed with its usual evening rhythm. Somewhere in that city, other families were facing similar struggles. Other young people were learning hard lessons about justice and injustice. Other witnesses were deciding whether to speak truth to power. The night was quiet, but it no longer felt empty or threatening. It felt full of possibility, imperfect, complicated possibility, but possibility nonetheless. And for Jordan Carter, that was enough to build a future on. 4 years after his trial, Jordan Carter walked across the stage at law school graduation. In the audience, Diana wiped tears from her eyes while Evelyn cheered loud enough to embarrass them both. Leo Harris was there too, along with David Mitchell, who had flown in from Colorado, where he now ran a non-profit training program for police departments on ethical decision-making. Your father would have been so proud, Diana said, adjusting his graduation stole. Jordan nodded, thinking of all the moments his father had missed, and all the lessons that had carried him through. I keep thinking about that last letter he wrote me, about becoming the person he believed I could be. And have you? Evelyn asked. Jordan considered the question. I think I'm getting there, but I also know the work is just beginning. As they walked toward their car, Jordan reflected on how his story had become part of something larger. The Jordan Carter Act had been implemented in 12 other states. His case was taught in law schools across the country. Young people like Marcus were choosing careers in civil rights law because they'd heard his story. But perhaps most importantly, families facing similar situations now had a roadmap, not just for legal strategy, but for emotional survival. They knew that hope wasn't naive, that justice wasn't impossible, and that sometimes the system could be changed, one case at a time. Lieutenant Whitfield had served her sentence and disappeared from public life. Officer Grant had tried to rebuild his career in private security but found that his reputation followed him. Both had paid prices for their actions, even if those prices seemed inadequate to some. Officer Mitchell had found his calling in reform work, using his experience to help other officers navigate the moral complexities of police culture. Leo Harris continued his quiet work as a community liaison, proof that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences when they chose courage over comfort. As Jordan walked home with his family, he caught sight of his father's badge in the window, reflecting the last rays of sunlight. Tomorrow he would start his career as a civil rights attorney. There would be more cases, more families needing help, more chances to turn pain into purpose. But tonight he was just a son coming home with his family, carrying forward the legacy of a man who had taught him that justice wasn't something that happened to you, it was something you fought for, every single day. The night was quiet, full of possibility, and Jordan Carter was ready for whatever came next.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.